Hi, Whitney. It's Grandma. We're coming down to the BYU for the ball game this Saturday, and we was wondering if you needed some peaches or some salsa or something. Anyway, give me a call if you get a minute. Love ya.
When I was a freshman at BYU, my grandma, Donna Dayton, who lives in Heber, Utah, would regularly leave messages like that one on my dorm room answering machine. When she did, my roommates wouldn't let me delete the message until they'd all heard it because they loved my grandma and her adorable Utah accent. I grew up in California, and we used a very specific phrase when we impersonated a Utah accent. Dorothy, that's a gorgeous orange farmal. Over the years, I've heard several other stereotypes about Utah lingo and pronunciation. But are all these stereotypes true? Is there such thing as a Utah accent? If so, what does it sound like? And while we're asking questions, what about those Utah names? Welcome to the Y Magazine podcast, bringing you ideas, stories, and voices from Brigham Young University. My name is Whitney Archibald, or Whitney, depending on who's saying it. My mom, born and raised in Utah, will tell you that she named me Whitney, not Whitney. And as you can hear on that answering machine message, my grandma goes heavy on that H. But my dad and I, both raised in California, have always pronounced it Whitney, without an audible H. Does that mean the wh is part of what we call the Utah accent? Not necessarily. David Eddington, an emeritus professor of linguistics at BYU, wrote a whole book on the topic of Utah linguistics called Utah English. Eddington says that while some Utahns may use it, that pronunciation is a better predictor of your age than the state you live in, and can be heard across the United States in older generations. But that's a common trap to fall into, generalizing a whole state or region based on anecdotal evidence. Here's another example.
People say, oh my heck, that's such a Utah expression. Is it pretty common in Utah? Yes, but you're going to find it all over the U.S., but maybe not with the frequency you're going to hear it in Utah.
Today we're going to dive into David Eddington's research to get to the bottom of the question of what truly constitutes Utah dialects. Then we'll talk to another linguistics professor, Dallin D. Oakes, who recently co-edited a book called Perspectives About Latter-day Saint Names and Naming about Utah naming trends, including his own quite popular name. This episode is based on a couple of different Y Magazine articles, Do Utahns Talk Funny in the Winter 2012 issue, and What's in a Baby Name in the Fall 2023 issue. David Eddington grew up in Utah and didn't notice anything unique about the way people talked. That is until he moved away and returned to the state about a decade later.
When I moved back, I started hearing things that I wasn't familiar with. And so I thought, did I change the way I speak since I've been away for 14 years? Or has Utah changed since I've been away? And so I started hearing all sorts of anecdotal things about, in Utah, people say this or that. And I thought, okay, I'm a scientist. I really want some tangible evidence. So that gave me the idea for going out and getting recordings and doing statistics and things like that. And what I found is lots of misinformation and myths and stereotypes that actually don't really jibe with what really exists in Utah.
Before we talk about more specific myths and stereotypes, I'm going to give you a little quiz to see how you pronounce things, whether you live in Utah or not. Number 1, if you don't pass the test, you blank. 2, when you're sick, the doctor asks you how you. Number 3, what do you call the big, tall, rocky thing with a Y on it behind the BYU campus? 4, what do you call the gray segmented bugs that roll up into balls? 5, how do you pronounce the city south of Provo, Spanish, blank? 6, what do you call bread dough that you fry and top with butter and honey? And 7, if you choose not to go to school, you blank school. Now, I'm not going to tell you the right answers because there aren't any, but David Eddington will explain what his research revealed about each of these words and how they're pronounced or used in Utah. I asked Eddington for examples of some of the common stereotypes of Utah English.
A lot of them have to do with what happens to the pronunciation of vowels before L sounds. So merger. So the vowels are the same. So the fill merger.
Right.
So I and E become the same thing before L sounds. So you'll hear people say, how do you feel today? Or another one is the fail-fell merger. So, I failed my test.
Uh-huh.
Pretty common things. These are the sorts of things that people from outside the state here in Utah, and they say that is a characteristic of Utah English, which it is for many Utahns, but you can find it in Texas, you can find it in New Mexico, you can find it in the South, you can find it in the Midwest to a certain degree. So is it unique to Utah? No.
Interesting. Okay. And then there's other things like omitting consonants.
I know what you're talking about, but I hate to say omitting. So you're thinking of words like mountain, where I just pronounced it with a t sound, but you can, you don't just drop the T out, you change it into a glottal stop. So mountain. So there's still something there. It's just not a T sound. So, general American English, unless you're being really careful, Americans don't say mountain and kitten and bitten.
Right.
They'll say mountain, kitten, and bitten with a glottal stop. But what people are hearing and stereotyping as a Utah accent isn't the glottal stop. It's what happens after that sound. So in general American English, right after that glottal stop, you'll have an n. So mountain. But people focus in on adding a vowel after the glottal stop. So mountain, kitten, Dayton,
Right.
mitten. Once again, that's not just found in Utah. We found it in Vermont and New York and California. And I mean, it's all over the U.S., maybe a little bit more frequent in Utah. And not all Utahns do it. In fact, you won't find many older Utahns saying that at all. It's mainly younger females. And what's really interesting about it is people have been so worked up about, I pronounce mountain funny. I need to do something. And so now this stereotypical characteristic of Utah English is overcompensating and pronouncing T's and saying mountain, Layton, kitten, which sounds really odd in American English. It sounds more like a British pronunciation.
That is so interesting. And just the fact that people would try to overcorrect and fix these things brings up just an interesting social aspect of all this. Like, why does it matter to people how people are pronouncing things?
Well, it's funny because people want to fit in, and that's what we actually do with language. The reason we have dialects and things like that is because we want to speak like the group of people that we belong to.
Mm.
And so, for example, I lived in the South for many years, and I did not pick up a Southern accent because it's not where I was from. And if I did, people would feel that I was being phony or fake about it.
Yeah.
And I'm from the Western U.S., and that's the way I speak. That's my linguistic heritage.
Yeah, it's interesting because my mother left Heber when she got married and shortly thereafter moved to California. And so she kind of lost a lot of that Heber accent. But then when she'd get together with her mom or her sisters, she'd kind of pick it back up again. Is that kind of a common thing?
Yes, because they're fitting into the group again. Yep. One stereotype that people have is that they think that there's some place, this imaginary place in the world where someone speaks without an accent.
Yeah.
And everybody has an accent. Even people who sign languages have different ways of signing depending on social variables. Yes. So everyone has a particular way of speaking that usually represents who they are and their social class and their gender and things like that.
That is so fascinating. What excites you about studying things like this? Why is it so fascinating to you?
Well, what is really fun is when I find something that I don't think anyone has commented on before. Finding something new. Now, this may not be 100% new, but what really fascinated me, for example, is, those little gray bugs that you find under rocks, and if you touch them, they roll into a ball?
Uh-huh.
What do you call those?
I call them roly-polies.
Roly-polies, or woodlouse, or pill bugs. In Utah and some surrounding states, they're called potato bugs.
Uh-huh.
And so I thought, well, that's interesting. Then I saw a linguistic map of where they say potato bug. And in addition to Utah and some other Western states, you find potato bug in upstate New York and northern Ohio, right where the pioneers came from.
Wow, that's so
So
interesting.
potato bug was probably taken right across the plains into Utah. And there's some other things, for example, that come from pioneers. One is a northeastern trait in the United States is pronouncing things like the Florida Orange Bowl or the Part Authority. Or if you next time you watch The Wizard of Oz, listen to how they pronounce Dorothy's name. They don't say Dorothy's, they say Dorothy. And where did that come from? The Northeast. Nothing was ever made up in Utah. It was brought in by the immigrants from that part of the U.S. And that particular pronunciation, it's interesting because it's on its way out. Younger people generally don't use it unless they live in very rural areas of the state. So, the Utah accent is always changing. The things like, how do you fill? And I failed the test. Those are on the way in, where Spanish Fark is on its way out.
Okay.
And mountain is on its way in, and mountain is on its way out.
Let's talk about how you discovered these trends and scientifically tracked them. Can you tell me about how you constructed your study?
Well, sure. What I did is an online survey, and I tried to get people from every county in the state involved. They got online, took a survey, and I got about 1,700 responses from different parts of the state, and that's what I based my study on.
How did you identify the specific questions to ask in the first place?
Well, first I went to the literature on Utah English and found what people had studied already, and then I considered the stereotypical things that people talk about in Utah and said, well, let's see if they actually are true.
How do you personally feel about some of these trends? Like, does it make you a little sad when you see some of these dialectical things disappearing and language homogenizing more?
I don't even know if it's homogenizing. I think some things will become more similar to surrounding dialects where other things will differentiate.
Okay.
So we have this sense that dialects are dying, and they're not. They're just changing.
Yeah, because sometimes you worry that with like mass media and stuff, everybody's listening to the same people and stuff that maybe some of those dialects are fading. And I just love the color that dialects bring. So that would be a sad thing.
Yeah, I don't think dialects will ever go away. They will just change. But we will always have a way of letting people know by the way we speak and the way we dress and the way we do our hair what group we belong to. Okay, let's see. Did you grow up in Utah or not?
No, I grew up in California.
Okay, you got to tell me this song, what the words are, okay?
Okay.
Da, 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 da.
Okay, the itsy bitsy spider went up the water spout.
Okay, for Utahns, especially older Utahns, it's eensy weensy spider. Where do you find people saying eensy weensy spider? Generally in the United States, it's itsy bitsy, but you find eensy weensy in England and Australia.
Really?
So I think Utah got a really late influx of British immigrants that the rest of the country didn't get. And so you'll find little things like that.
Huh. That is so interesting. Throughout your research, was there anything that did stand out as being very uniquely Utah?
Two that are very almost unique Utahisms. One is to slough school.
Ah.
I found occasional references to in other states, but very, very, very scattered. But in Utah, to slough school, to skip school, very common Utahism. Another one is when you take bread dough and fry it, most people call that fry bread.
Right.
But Utahns call it a scone.
I grew up calling it scones, having a mother who grew up in Utah.
Yeah. Languages are always going to change. And there are all these people who these language mavens and say, stop, English is going to the dogs. And they've been saying that for so long. And they just can't recognize that languages change. You can never stop that. I mean, at what point do they want to go back and say, well, this is the perfect English? At what point? Do we go back to Shakespeare? Do we go back to Old English? But if we went back there, we'd find out Not everyone spoke the same. There were dialects back then, too.
So is there such a thing as a Utah accent? Yes and no.
Not everybody in the state of Utah speaks the same way.
Right.
Nor do they say the same word the same way every single time. So there's always a lot of variability, and it's based on where they're from, how old they are, how much education they have, what their gender is. All those sorts of factors come into place. And so you can't just say, Utahns say X. It's usually Utahns of a particular place and age, and they tend to say X maybe 5% of the time. Is there a Utah accent? They're a collection of characteristics which, taken together, could be considered a Utah accent.
Now let's switch gears to another matter of Utah linguistics, baby names. I love talking about the names people choose for their babies. In fact, it's one of my best party tricks. If there's ever a lull in the conversation in a large group, I often find a way to bring up baby names because everyone seems to have a story about interesting names they've encountered. Our fascination with names makes sense.
There's maybe nothing more closely associated with your personal identity than your name.
That was Dallin D. Oakes, another BYU linguistics professor who inherited his name from his father, President Dallin H. Oakes, first counselor in the first presidency of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We'll talk about the origin and trendiness of their shared name in a bit. Oakes was the lead editor for a recent book, Perspectives About Latter-day Saint Names and Naming, which includes research from several different professors from BYU and other institutions. The first half of the book is about cultural and historical naming practices among Latter-day Saints, and the second half is about names in Latter-day Saint doctrine and scripture. Most of this research focuses on Utah because of the high concentration of Latter-day Saints in the state. For example, a chapter by BYU linguistics professor Lynn Hendrickson and a group of co-researchers talks about Scandinavian influences on the names of people and places in Utah. Here's Dallin Oakes.
In central Utah, there were a lot of people with the same name because of the Scandinavian population that had immigrated there. So there might be a ton of Pete or Peterson. So you'd have Big Pete and Little Pete, and then a guy who did shingles for people. He was Shingle Pete. Because if you just said Pete Peterson in a small knit Scandinavian community, that could be almost, 20 guys or something.
I love that.
So they had really interesting nicknames. And it is, if you look at the immigration into Utah, it's fascinating because some of them came as immigrant groups and went to specific communities, not just the Scandinavians in central Utah, like San Pete and Sevier counties, but we have, a lot of people don't realize, I think it's the largest immigrant community of Icelanders who settled in Spanish Fork.
These immigrant groups influenced the names of places and people in the regions where they settled. There's also a chapter by Don Norton, an emeritus BYU English professor, about the 20th century naming trend in Utah of compound names, like Rondell, Juanetta, and Janelle, which was actually almost my name. Often these compound names combined the names of a mother and father for their baby, such as Jay Lynn, daughter of Jay and Linda, and Tara Lee, daughter of Terry and Lee. Another trend was adding traditionally feminine endings to male names like Earlene, Boydine, Elietta, and Jolena. And for a while, there were a lot of names that started with La, like Lavelle, LaRue, Laverle, and Ladon. The chapter of the book, Perspectives About Latter-day Saint Names and Naming, that we're going to talk most about today is by Cleveland Evans, a naming expert and an emeritus psychology professor at Bellevue University. Evans is not a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but was interested in the religious origins of many Utah names. Dallin Oakes first met him at a conference, and Evans immediately guessed how he got his name.
I had not met him before, but I had seen a book he had written, and I was shocked to see that in his list of the top 500 boys' names, he had Dallin. And I thought that was never my experience when I was growing up. It seemed that nobody had that name. And I was surprised. But then when I looked at his sampling technique, he had looked at health department names for 13 states. And one of them happened to be Utah. I introduced myself, and he was aware of my father. And then he said something like, I'm assuming that he got his name from the artist Cyrus E. Dallin, who did the sculpture on the Salt Lake Temple of the Angel Moroni. And so he goes into this saying, telling me where he thought the origin of the name for my father had come from. And he was absolutely right. My
That's
grandmother
awesome.
had been there to the unveiling of a statue, a bust of a pioneer woman, and she was pregnant at the time. She made a decision then, if this baby in my womb is a boy, I'm going to name him Dallin. So I was just so impressed at what he was able to kind of ferret out, and his conclusions often seemed so right on.
Dallin Oakes knew he wanted Evans to contribute to this book, and he asked him to help answer the question, are Latter-day Saint children's names really distinctive?
He found that if you compare Utah and Colorado, which is what he always did in his comparisons, and because he wanted to isolate a different variable of regionality, two Western states that are, right next to each other and had different religious demographics, and make that comparison. But what he found is if you put the names, the top 100 names for a given year from the two states next to each other, you don't find a very big difference for the top 100 names. If something is a number one name in Utah, it might be the fifth most popular name in Colorado. There are differences, but they're differences within a certain range. Almost all of the names that are in the top 100 in Utah are also in the top 100 in Colorado. But when you get past the top 100 and you get down to the ones that are, maybe 200th place or 250th place in popularity or something, then you start seeing some real differences. And when you get down to the ones that are relatively few, you start seeing things like Iron Rod or Stripling Warrior or things like that. But by no means are those more common than names like Michael or Susan or something like that. For the most part, they're pretty comparable. But when you get into some of the idiosyncratic patterns, because there are differences.
Right.
In Utah, for example, in 2012, for whatever reason, we liked presidential names. Not up at the top of the list necessarily, but still a real presence, a discernible pattern. Cleveland Evans expressed surprise in his article that one of the president names that was much more popular in Utah than Colorado was Nixon. And of course, we had girls with names like Reagan and Kennedy.
Yep.
And I think those were found in Colorado as well. But the thing that really stood out to him, first of all, I think we had a greater popularity with presidential names in 2012 than Colorado. But what really stood out was the use of Nixon as a name that you just didn't see very much of that at all in Colorado. And so, and other patterns for whatever reason in 1998 when he sampled Book of Mormon names for male babies for that year seemed to be more popular. And he thought that was the beginning of a trend in greater popularity. But when he sampled again in 2012, they had declined. So you get the ups and downs in popularity of things. But he pointed out that names like Caden and Jaden and I can't remember, Caden, Jaden.
I'll help him out here. The third one is Braden.
They were first popularized in Utah. That doesn't mean they were invented in Utah.
Right.
They could have existed prior, but they rose right near the top in popularity here in Utah. And then as Utahns kind of got tired of that name, it started to fall on the list, but it was rising in Colorado. So
interesting.
He was just noticing that sometimes we're at the front end of popularization of certain names.
What about the stereotype of creative spelling in Utah names?
Well, I think a lot of individuality and uniqueness is manifested in the spellings that people do. Mm-hmm. Back in 1997, I think, I had a colleague who documented more than 21 different spellings of Utahns that, had babies born that year for the name Mackenzie.
Really?
And it was over 21 different spellings. We're not saying 21 people named their kid that. We're saying there were 21 different spellings. Oh, the frequency of the name Dallin is one of the things that he talks about in his, discussion of differences between Utah and Colorado.
Oh,
So
interesting.
you see the name Dallin occur a good number of times in Utah. And I don't know, maybe he saw 2 occurrences in Colorado. And so he saw a little bit in Colorado, but not like Utah. And also Spencer, at least in one of the years he sampled, much more common in Utah than Colorado. In fact, there may not have even been, I'd have to look back at the data, but there may not have even been a single Spencer in one of the years he sampled in Colorado, but there were certainly a good number of them in Utah. And he attributes that in part, at least, to Spencer W. Kimball. People hear the name, and even if they're not thinking specifically of the prophet, they still hear the name and say,
they have good
I like that name.
associations. Yeah. I know a Kimball or two also.
Yeah.
That's another thing about Utah culture is that there are larger families. And so it gets harder and harder to come up with those names. So you may need to draw upon more resources as you get down. I mean, even naming my 4th boy was tricky.
Yeah. And you may have seen a note I made about the fact that you have things like series names, where, all the kids have a name that begins with J, or we knew some people that they started with A, and then the next kid would be a name beginning with B, and then the next kid would have a C right down through the list. And yeah, it's kind of interesting. I mean, I don't imagine those patterns get started much in areas where they don't have very many kids.
Right.
And Eric Eliason talks about the fact that one of the common things that happens in the LDS community, at least here in America, is to give a boy his mother's maiden name as his middle name, because that makes genealogy easier to do, because then you know what his mom's maiden name was.
Well, and it also is a way to carry on that name that otherwise might be lost.
Yeah. And in fact, that's my middle name is my mother's maiden name.
Oh.
So that was done in my own family.
In case you're curious, his middle name is Dixon. Ultimately, Cleveland sums up his research with this conclusion. The kernel of truth in the idea that Latter-day Saint parents favor unusual names is that while the huge majority of Utah parents use the same names as the rest of the country, enough favor unusual names that people will remember it. He continues, as a psychologist, I know that vivid and striking things will often distort people's memories so that we think unusual examples are more common than they are. As for me, I say bring on all the interesting names, creative spellings, and regional dialects. At the very least, they make for some great dinner conversation. Okay, Grandma, what's the name of the song about the spider crawling up the waterspout?
Eensy weensy spider climbed up the water spout.
What are those gray segmented bugs that roll up in a ball and hide under logs?
I don't even know. I can't remember a lot of this stuff,
How about you, Laurel? What do you call them?
Oh, those are tater bugs.
And you can both answer this one. What do you call it when you fry dough and then top it with butter and honey?
Scones.
Ooh, yummy scones.
Thank you for listening to the Y Magazine podcast. Special thanks to my grandma, Donna Dayton, who's 94, and her friend, Laurel North, for lending their voices to this episode. If you're enjoying this podcast, please tell your friends and family so we can grow. And we'd love to hear your feedback and suggestions. You'll find a link to our listener survey in the show notes. If you enjoyed this episode, you may also enjoy an episode about how artificial intelligence is changing the landscape of language and writing. It's called Writing and Teaching with ChatGPT. This episode was produced by me, Whitney Singley Archibald, with executive producer Brooklyn Hughes Romer. Editing by student intern Abby Horsepool. Original music, mixing, and mastering by Jarrett Davis.